Hello everyone, today we talk about the composition of Roman society, the Patricians and the Plebeians, and more specifically of the formation of the two ordines and the secession of the Plebs in 494-93 BC, right? So this is a very interesting topic, I think, but also a very difficult one to discuss. I think, first of all, we never addressed early Roman history except for that video I made on the Servian Reform of the Roman army, that I mentioned also because it's gonna be, useful for today's topic, and that also presents a brilliant example of what we're going to see now. That it is essentially the large part, if not the wide majority of the events that we study in Roman history before essentially the 70s of the 3rd century BC may have simply not existed, and still reflecting, though, actual historical events that happened usually much more recently than what the Roman historiography and chronology in that sense rewrote in some ways, or had to write from scratch in the first place, because they had to make sense of a lot of things that had happened but that they weren't directly documented upon, and that they, however, still lived quite strongly from a cultural point of view. So naturally, most of Roman history predating this 70s of the 3rd century is between history and myth, fundamentally, and it's been written much later, especially in a time in which Rome had already developed from a political and social point of view in quite peculiar and articulate ways that naturally were well documented at the time, and that the same Romans somewhat projected in the past, essentially to justify the foundation of certain institutions and orders and groups. And this is very important, because Roman history indeed is old and long, and there is actually an enormous chunk of Italic history that we know Rome was intertwined with, that we know fairly well from other sources, right? If you look at the Etruscan history, Rome was within it, right, during the Tarquinian times. And there is all an interest also coming from outside of Italy, or from usually, in fact, Hellenic and Hellenistic historiography that take in consideration many things, in which we can trace, albeit with great difficulty, at least the major political and military events. But when it comes to internal politics and society, well, things really get problematic, right? We have enormous difficulties in even understanding what terms such as, for example, the Patres and the conscripti, or the Patres conscripti, because we don't even know whether we should associate them, or the difference between populus and plebs, right? There is no univocal historiographical interpretation about it. There are hypotheses, some are definitely better than others, and we should explain them in a dedicated video, because they're really big things, right, to explain, and very, and based on a great deal of evidence from several specialistic fields that is not easy to recollect. But we can trace definitely an essential line of what fundamentally happened. You know that on Schwerpunkt we care the most about politics and the military, fundamentally. So the history of Rome would be, as we know, the one of a warlike society, of a society that, especially starting from the second half of the 4th century onwards, began to acquire this kind of predatory and legalistic character that we have learned to love, that was enormously brutal and aggressive, and yet the foundation of so much that our civilization, our true civil and civic values also stem from, right? Without these Italic populations quite recently, quite speedily converted to civilization, how we could define the Romans in a certain sense, we would have not had much of what we are today, and about which we should be proud. Like, as we have seen many times, we observed that civilization is not such because is not violent. Actually, the greatest civilizations we've ever had some of the most highly destructive potentials, right, as we have today, fundamentally. So we have to understand certain things first, and then realize why these times are important. And there's been a time in my life some years ago which I concentrated and got terribly interested. My favorite period in Roman history is maybe banally the 3rd century BC. I got interested also in the first BC. Not a huge lover of early Roman times. I mean, I love them, of course, as as much as I can, but it's still an area that, okay, we know better, and we know how it's gone, right? When we talk about the Roman military, which we've done pretty often, we're very privileged because objectively we have an enormous amount of sources about what was at the time the universal empire that produced a striking amount of evidence, and yet at the same time, unfortunately, is also, pretty scanty, right? We don't know effectively, for example, what the Roman army was, right? Today we think what the Roman army was. No, we don't. We largely, some of the most important things we fundamentally don't know throughout all this period. And when you look at the empire, because also historiographically speaking, I think there's been obviously a massive interest towards early imperial times. It is the first one, especially the late Republic and the early empire, the Principate. Then we have realized that also late Roman times weren't that bad as they were pictured back in the 18th century. We extended on that so much that many of you were enthusiastic also, to hear that. I would like to start, and I probably will, in fact, start, a series dedicated to what we call as Byzantine history. Later on, it's still Roman, fully. And naturally, there is, who knows, a little bit better Roman times looks at objectively at the 3rd century as the moments of greatest glory, right, and greatest achievement, and the expansion of the Mediterranean, the creation effectively of a true empire that is going out of Italy and creating provinces to rule in a colonial, imperialistic way. But also and especially, and that's what has drawn immensely my attention in recent times, I didn't have a lot of opportunity to look at, is the immediate before, right? That is entering in this realm, really, of, partial fantasy, but fantasy in the sense that it contains still from an anthropological, religious, and, cultural, broadly meant point of view, an immense series of data and of vision that makes you really understand what the Roman world could be at the time, where the Romans that we know, finally better, right, came from. That's a field in which, aside there are people who even think that, Furius Camillus existed, that those are actual people that existed in history. I'm sorry, that's not true. Like, it might have been, actually, but it's possible that Furius Camillus existed, but we have no certainty whatsoever. But it's the actual symbolism and value in those traditions that are you can't read as rationalized and secularized history, because it's none of that, right? It's first of all, it's founded exclusively on a religious base, like all Roman history. Secondly, there is a deeper meaning that objectively, if you don't, as I don't, for example, have a deep, insightful religious and kind of philological, linguistical expertise, it's very, very difficult to dig in. But we will try that, right? And as you know, we are in this phase of Schwerpunkt that I don't know where it will end, in which we talk just about manualistic levels, right? And today I would not like to go much in historical depths. I could talk quite a long time about the Latin Etruscan wars, or the Battle of the Allia River, for example. There's plenty of fascinating stuff from that time. There's a beautiful book, if you're interested, about Furius Camillus, especially that is Dumenzil's, right, one. That Dumenzil is an author is being criticized because he in his lifetime was closer to a certain political view, right? So it's been contested. He was stressing the Indo-European legacy of Rome, etc. But it's actually it's a book about history of religions, right? So, and it's actually very insightful, very beautiful. It's been reevaluated recently, because rightfully so. The 20th century, in all its catastrophe and destruction, has also produced certain minds that are definitely worth to read back in the day, and it really opens your eyes of what were the Romans what we think the Romans could think at the time, at reality of politics, at the gods, and it's extremely and brutally fascinating. And you realize from there how this is not history. Like, it fits into a much broader religious anthropological metaphor that must be deciphered, and that yet contains the germs of actual history behind that, right? The figure of Furius Camillus is actually very, very important. It's historical in the sense that it does trace, as we were saying at the beginning, the a pattern that surely one or more people have supported, have brought forward, that had changed Rome in the way we have known it. And this is deeply connected also to the so-called military reforms. When, if you look at that video I made, for example, about the Servian reform, I was discussing that as fundamentally as it had actually happened canonically the end of the 6th century, that story, but that's just the traditional context, right? There are lots of things about Roman history, even more recent times, that are actually just historiographical traditions that actually do not reflect any further evidence about certain things. There is a sort of barrier, unfortunately, that stands very often in ancient history in general between the historiography of the time and the actual evidence on the, I would say, on the ground. If there wasn't archaeology, but archaeology can unfortunately uncovers certain aspects. So today, I would really like to draw a general picture of what is, in fact, as we've seen, the creation of the two orders and the plebeian secession of supposedly the 5th century BC. That here it's not even the beginning of the 5th century BC. That here is not important to temporalize like that, right? I have a wholly different interpretation in that regard. So according to tradition, that a short before there had been this, Servian reform that was conceived on a democratic base, that is effectively on the classes of census with the various orders and the classes of recruitment, etc. And allegedly, what would be the geopolitic phase of the Roman army, which actually never happened. Also, sorry to say that, like, it was a similarly conceived, but first of all, we don't know this reform actually even happened in reality. Secondly, whatever it happened or not, which towards actually the 4th century, what was going on, right, was probably starting to form for real, at least as a general direction. Absolutely didn't see the Romans fighting as Hellenic hoplites, but by any standard. Like, the Romans had a completely different politics, society, right? And what we see as the Servian reform is actually evolving quite directly what we know instead as the Camillian Reform, that conventionally speaking also, I can't say it didn't exist, but at least even in here, it passed through much deeper transformations. So we have this is one of the historiographical traditions I was talking to you about. I mean, it's this idea of fixing certain particular autocrats / reformers of the Roman military to trace the history of the evolution of the Roman army, which actually didn't happen anything like that. Not even Marius actually transformed a big deal, for example, from a technical point of view, the army, right? He just made a political reform, a recruitment reform. It wasn't about the essence of the actual organization that had already gone in that way. But that's another thing that I also come to repeat every time. But that is just an example because it happened at the end of the 2nd century BC. So in times in which we actually know an enormous amount of things, right? More, at least for this time. And this is important because the creation of the, let's say, of what we can call as the patricians and the plebeians, or better, the plebeians as such, as two orders, conflictual orders, more or less. So, I mean, definitely so, but not necessarily so, openly as we may believe, as the later Roman historians has made us think, for reasons that at the time were much more cogent, is so important, because if it was effectively revolving around the political and military structure of Rome, right? It was also naturally a socio-economical thing. It was all together as well as the clause of its in Trinity. shows us, but it definitely corresponds to a specific time in Roman history that can be summed up in more or less like the following. So in general, there is even in here the realization that we're not talking about a linear process, right? Many reforms, including the what we call the Camillian one, for example, that is effectively a political social one in many ways, because it somewhat introduced the salary to the troops, right? Or better, sort of compensation for military expenses. Yeah, it was not Marius. Surprise, surprise, because certain things do not really go by such anecdotal points of references. These are long processes, and when you surpass seasonalism, like it happened to Rome after the long and extenuating siege of Veii, sieges also, because it was multiple operations. You enter into professionalism in a word or another. Like there is a component of society that starts to see war as fundamentally as a profession, as a business, right? And even in the contrast between the plebeians, in this canonical contrast between patricians and plebeians, you see so much blurring in there that really makes you reconsider a lot. Think about even the Claudi, how they, mostly patricians, but they back definitely that, let's say, the Camillian, pro-plebeian, we could say, all by terrible approximation in the expansion, for example, in Campania, right, or against the Samnites. So it's a lot of back and forths, right? Also in here we should distinguish, for example, there's a lot of confusion to enumerate these actual reforms, because the Camillian Reform was that one, right? Always remaining that it's just a conventional name for a longer process. That there is so-called the manipular reform, that is actually the tactical development of what becomes the manipular legion that is so famous in the Plebeian description, that even gives the name to the legion, historiographically speaking. There's also another sub-definition that is the Livian reform, that is once again, this in between, the end of the 4th century. Now it's complicated, we don't have time to discuss it, but that's already too recent in time. We don't get up there today. But it's important to realize that these military reforms definitely corresponded to political struggle in a way or another. Even if you look at the history of Furius Camillus, you see that first he launched this sort of reform. He started paying and including larger amounts of people in the army. There was, as we'll see now, a much more aristocratic in character at the time. And then fundamentally there is the disaster of the Alia and the sack of Rome, because Camillus has been rejected. So you see the conflict there. But Camillus comes back, and that is very interesting, because normally the history of the sack of Rome is said like this is just a moral justification. All the story that after the sack Camillus pursued the Gauls and takes their loot, etc. Maybe there were effectively other Gauls. There weren't the one from Brennus that are to be found, for example. Some random Gauls, we don't know what they were exactly, but from a few years later in Sicily, hired by Dionysius of Syracuse, right, as mercenaries. But the idea that Furius Camillus eventually, from the Fasti, from these annals of these Roman magistrates, you see that comes back prepotently with this great influence on the city, makes you realize that there was probably a continuity of a certain address and some that Camillus embodied in some way that had been obstacled at some point, right? And in telling the truth, for the sake of historical correctness, we don't know effectively, even if the Gallic invasion brought to this reform or not, right? It's something that had started before, right? The Battle of the Allia River is beautiful because according to some interpretations, you could even trace their sort of embryo of the triplex Accius of the Manipular Legion. And that is enormously fascinating, also for what it means for the various, social segmentation in classes and the record on the army. But it's just an hypothesis. We effectively do not know. It's all extremely foggy. most of the conventional things that you read around, that the Romans copied tactics from here and there, from the Samnites, from the Maniples. It's all, like, if you really want to take it from me, it's a load of garbage. Like, first of all, we have no idea. Secondly, there are hints that suggest very, very different things that are internal to Roman politics and society. Do not look at the mechanicistic things like tactics effectively change because, there is just a command from the top that decides that from a day to another troops have to be radically organized in a different way, just because they had to adapt to the Samnitic hill grounds, right? No. But it's much deeper. It's a much greater deal, and in this sense, tactics is detached from much more important things that were going on, and they are tied to the patricians and the plebeians. So this is interesting because you realize that, for example, the patricians were thought to have been the patres to have been instituted as senators by Romulus himself, right? But we'll see better what we'll see now. But just for seeing that this division that eventually came later, also with the plebs as a major element of Roman society, developing fundamentally its own political assemblies and prerogatives, right? And even to parallel and counter the patrician power is something that was probably taking place much later, and exactly in this context of the 4th century was likely before. So, at least the way I see it, it's practically certain that at least up to the mid-5th century, Roman society had essentially a sacral character, right? When we look at Rome in how it was founded, it was created, we have to think at the true primitiveness of the Roman archaic world. That is not to say that effectively this was not an important center, because Tarquinian Rome was a big deal, was considered the great Rome of the Tarquinii, right? It had a great influence of the Latin Confederacy. It was the center of the whole thing, but it was still framed into a sort of foreign domination, and still Roman society was somewhat organized on tribal and very elitary fashion, right? In a way that had a very few to do, in fact, with the alleged democracy that it never became later. Like, Rome has always been effectively an oligarchy, whatever side you want to see from it, right? They had a republic, but talking about democracy for Rome, really no, we can't really listen to that. But this sacral power was associated probably with very strong warlike roots since the beginning, with this power detained by the sacerdotal class that was organized in powerful family clans. We're talking about major names like the Fabii, for example, or the Quincti, that embodied an elite in all sense, right? It was very aristocratic, and it definitely had a tribal and warrior military ethos, and definitely functioned very similarly to other tribal contexts, right? If not for the fact that that Latium in itself was already a much more advanced place than the rest of Italy, frankly, because the majority of the Italic peoples lived still in a sort of, that weren't very different from, I don't know, the Celtic world, the Iberian world. They were essentially tribesmen, all right, and were very different political cultures at that point. Rome was a massive center, right? It was very well placed. It was developed fast, as we'll see now, and in this very fertile Tiber Valley that connected it also to the Tyrrhenian Sea and to some of the most thriving commerces, right? And it had been inserted in the circuit of the Etruscan League, we can call it, right? Even in there we should discuss about what that actually means, it seems that at a certain point towards the mid-5th century was a major, I don't even know how to say that, of the patricians, right? That is to say, Rome had always been actually very open to various and different elites. Like Rome is born effectively through the integration of many elements. I mean, fundamentally there were Latins and Sabines, but you can find other, Etruscans, of course, other Italics, Greeks, and even Punics in some measure. In an horizon that you realize is much larger than a tribe, right? But that it still puts at the center this kind of military character of the warrior that rules in the name of power itself, right? And it's what also the concept of imperium stemmed from. I mean, eventually, even there, too much of Roman history of this time it's a creation of the 1st century BC. But definitely the religious ideal of divine power descending into the warriors and effectively giving them this prerogative that was embodied by the sacerdotal class that belonged to these clans, to this elite, was the simplification of this crude, brutal, warlike, military nature of Roman mindset and customs is something that it's rarely stressed enough, right? The Romans effectively had, first of all, an enormous and plurisecular difficulty to eradicate it in part only from what could make them reach the levels of discipline that the Roman legion would effectively have, right? But the Roman mindset it's really emerging extremely fast from a world that was effectively barbaric, right? In the neutral or even positive term that we can use in this sense. And that was so warlike. There is a huge, massive difference, for example, between the Hellenic models and the Roman one, right? Rome is effectively a polis in many ways, right? Of course, it's not an Hellenic polis, but I mean the model came from there. Came actually through the Etruscans via Greece, right? As it happened in other advanced areas of the Mediterranean. But Greece is an exception, right? Greece, the Hellenic model doesn't work it works only in the motherland, right? It doesn't even work in the Hellenic colonies that transform immediately themselves in other places in something completely different. The Hellenic polis conceived, for example, war as a barbaric endeavor. Like they didn't practice war on a regular basis. Sparta is the only exception in this regard. The Hellenic polis were made up of essentially of amatorial militias, right? The Romans were warriors in the true sense of the word. You pick them up, or an Illyrian, a Thracian warrior, Germanic warrior, whatever. The Romans are, mentally speaking, coming from there. That is, they have a true lust for war, right? But at the same time, they're exposed since a very early age to some of the most advanced Mediterranean cultures of the time, and therefore that is something that develops a lot of intelligence, right? Being exposed to so many influences and growing within them, right? In a society that had always been inclusive, like Romulus, the history of the rape of the Sabines, what is that, right? Effectively, the young Latin, the young Italic tribes did that. We know that just like other peoples in Central Europe, they once there were too many in a certain place, the young males went away as a band of warriors, and they went literally slaughtering and other tribes and settling there and seizing their women and founding this other communities. That's the history of the Indo-Europeans by a large margin for a long time, in a nutshell. And if you take Romulus, that seizes literally the Sabine women, and that's also what Rome was stemmed from in part. It's the symbol in itself, in the legend, in the idea that the Romans were never a race as such, right? This was a stereotype also that the same Romans played later on. Stressing the fact that they didn't have quite of an individual genus, right? They were something that was probably formed at this very time we're discussing now, right? It previously was not there, because previously there was probably, in spite of all, the realization that yes, there was a mixed background, but at the same time the same patrician, in fact, families, the same nobiliar families, were kind of lineages on their own. They had a kind of a tribal and specific character that was almost ethnical, racial, right? This is very important because there is also an enormous debate relatively to this period of Roman history of who was at the top also in the guise of which, right? The Italic migrations in the Italian peninsula are very fascinating because, first of all, we know nothing about them. So, but it's difficult to stress that it was just like a classist and ethnicistic division of the people. In fact, from a strictly genetic point of view, right, the Italics blended pretty quickly into the, albeit there were many, like the Italics were, Italy was also Florida, as you know, populated, fertile. It had immense resources at the time, but naturally there had been other peoples there, right? But it's the political and military model that remains, the one of the Arians, in the sense of, a sort of a caste, in a certain sense, that this sacerdotal class actually embodied in a way or another, that was naturally more fluid than a caste. It's nothing like, I don't know, Vedic India, where there was an actual racial contempt. Like, there was really a strong humiliation, insubordination, inferiorization of the conquered peoples, at least for as far as we can see. These societies were being also simpler in a way, less stratified. They were kind of more horizontally fluid. So at least from a strictly aristocratic point of view, were people coming from everywhere, yeah, but they were still aristocrats, right? And we can see with enormous difficulty before the mid-5th century so the rest of this population was theoretically not scum, but traditionally in the Latin, Sabine, Italic background in here, that they were those who didn't have the privilege of being warriors, right? We don't know how it actually worked. As far as we understand, it's easy that, as it has always happened in any other Indo-European situation, whichever, I mean, here we're very far from the Aryan migrations, but whichever this worked like, it's obvious that these aristocrats had their own ranks of non-freemen, like of troops that followed them, right? This almost Homeric, heroic model, right? That was proper of all the world in the Bronze Age and in for many other cultures, and also in the Iron Age, in fact. For which, yeah, there is technically the hero, the nobleman, the head of the family, this master, powerful warrior with the best equipment, best training, most ferocious, individualistic mindset. But then there is a lot of people that actually fight alongside him, and that have always been there. Like heroic warfare, as we imagine it, just two guys fighting and deciding the war, never quite happened. Like there are, outbursts of romanticism, of poetry in this regard, but they never quite occurred. So, we're in another, what we call the people, right? Let's put it in this way, more simply, had always, in my opinion, participated to war. Also because Rome, as we know it, wasn't quite a city, right? As we conceive it. I mean, it was all these hills over the Tiber, and literally, I mean, on some of them there were the Sabines for a long time, and then there were the Etruscans for from the other side of the Tiber, like the right bank of the Tiber. Even if you go in Rome today, let's say in the city, the right bank of the Tiber, it's actually Etruria, right? It's where the Etruscans lived. There was also an Etruscan quarter, as a matter of fact, there. Also because Rome was a very important trading post, so naturally it evolved as such. So the Etruscans were there. But they were just next door. I mean, the closest, Etruscan city, think about Fidenae, for example, was just a few not even, a few kilometers away. So this is very fascinating because it realized also the fluidity of the internal, of the composition of Roman society, right? It was not a civic unity, right? Rome was not built as a polis. It eventually became in its order, but it was also something, slightly and consistently and substantially different, right? And that's where the ferocity of a tribal society, however, is also smart, because in this sense, it's not exclusivistic, right? The Roman identity eventually developed, even if it was granted through the citizenship system much later than this, but it was still exclusive in its character, right? In here, the thing was really, the political power was based on much different systems, right? So by the mid-5th century, we see this kind of block instead of the inclusivity of the patricians, of the nobles, right? That now we will eventually define better in the process of formation between plebeians and patricians, seeing what actually this meant. And this phenomenon has to do with the perennial scarcity of land that starts afflicting the Roman society of the time. Why did this happen exactly? Why that break? So there's this chain of events that brings to the fall of the great Rome of the Tarquinians, right? Rome, at that point under the Etruscans, that give it a lot, right? The Etruscans give Rome a civilization, as we mean it, in a kind of a proto-statal sense. They showed them, effectively, the Etruscans were sort of polis, right? Also in there, much more differently, even the Dodecapolis, right, is not really, we don't even know what those 12 cities were, but we do know, definitely, the Etruscans had something similar, yet even the Etruscans weren't at all a polis, in the sense that in the Greek sense. I mean, they were dominated by aristocracy that was even much, the Etruscan society was massively, and I stress massively socially stratified. Like, there was just a tiny bulk of very powerful and wealthy aristocrats and an enormity of peasants. That's it. Even the Italic Umbri actually were similar to that, also were pretty close. Whereas the central and southern properly Italic tribes were instead more kind of Indo-European, in fact in character, also in language, because they were technically Indo-Europeans. The Etruscans we don't really know, but there were many. They were pretty more egalitarian. Right, this is not definitely what you can see in Rome better than others, but definitely compared to, because Rome was probably most stratified society, at least in this point, right, before the Oscan peoples invaded the rich cities of Campania and formed their own aristocracies there as well. But Rome is effectively an Etruscan city. This is the very important thing to stress in here. If you look at the Samnites, for example, and Oscan peoples, you see among these Italics there is a completely different, more egalitarian view, right? They're still warriors, but they also share grazing areas. They have confederacies. They're and also the Latins behave in this way, right? But in their Italic characters is fundamentally strong, even in it. But the Latium is richer, is wealthier, and it's also growing in this regard. So the Etruscans here have been crushed. If you think about the defeats at sea there, this great fall of the Tarquinians brings to a major collapse, of which different peoples now, including the Romans, other Latins, and also the Greeks of Cuma, for example, begin to take their place in the area. There were other Etruscans, like famously Porsenna, where there was the Lucumon of Clusium, right, that came to substitute the Tarquinians in Rome, and was defeated by, in fact, the Latins and the Greeks combined, and Rome is living actually a pretty difficult time in here, because there are lots of peoples now that, they are emancipating politically from the Etruscans, and they, the relation with the Etruscans has always been strained, right? Because those were effectively, we can't call them invaders or foreigners, or at least they belong to another system, to the Latin one. And so here Rome is taking back what it belongs, according to her. But they are also witnessing the invasion of Latium by other by other peoples, right? The Romans, for example, defeat the Latins at the Battle of the Lake Regillus, right? And here you see that it's the patricians that effectively lead to victory, right? The patricians here were, as we've seen, the military elite, right? They're still in charge of the situation. The Tarquinians had fundamentally co-opted the same Roman elites. They had not gone with so much iron fist, but still this elite wanted to emerge, and definitely the city had developed a lot under the Etruscans as well, that had endowed it with a lot of structures, of order, of even of personnel coming from Etruria. I mean, it had grown, right? But therefore, when the Etruscans go, the Roman noblemen want to maintain now the control effectively on this city. At the same time, they realize that they're preventing the rest of the people to take over, or at least to present a problem, a competitor in any case. This is very important because there are countless examples in history where you find a domination that here, there are not powerful states. It's a sort of, you have to necessarily co-opt the elites to rule one place. So this favored the patricians at the time of the Etruscans, because these were the points of reference, right, for these fewer clans that controlled the city effectively, keeping the people down and siding with the Etruscan masters, right? So this is roughly, approximately the picture. And this elite was, as we've seen, important because it saved Rome at Lake Regillus, for example. And now, however, the situation is critical, because there are other peoples that, as we've seen here, especially the Oscans, that are swarming into, especially the lower Latium, and in Campania as well, right, with which Rome has important ties. But think about, peoples like the Volsci, for example, that really cut literally the terrestrial connections, right, with of Rome in the south, towards the south. But just to tell you how still tribal the context is in many ways in what we call the city, is this repeated attempts of occupation of the Capitol Hill by parts of Sabine armed groups, right? And this is the moment in which the Claudi, that it's one of the most famous, most noble Roman gentes, will effectively come. The Julio-Claudians, it's an imperial dynasty, as you well know, and they are the same theoretically. Like it's here that traditionally they descended in the city, right? The Claudi were Sabines themselves, right? Sabini in Latin, and they ended up actually to dominate the Roman policy for years, albeit at least in this tradition being remembered as kind of evil, right? In character, and there is this idea that the Claudi were every gens had its own kind of stereotypical character. The Claudi were very tough and also kind of sinisterly and cruelly oriented in some ways. That's also what the later Flavian historiographical cliche played on, right? And the Claudi are, however, patricians since the beginning. So we know that in this legendary phase of Roman policy, there was still a difficulty, right? The patricians needed to integrate other foreigners to their order. Here we're talking even about demographic problems, and also because Latium, as we were saying, was populated, right? And all the problem here is that the aristocracy wanted to maintain the power of all the land and preventing the people controlling it as well. And yet they had to cope with all these military threats, and therefore excluding from the military, hence the political rights, these other masses that we know basically nothing about, that, however, was a very risky thing to do, because you basically rule the city with this political and military, let's say, yes, numerical and qualitative elite alike, right? That has a massive military I don't even know how to say this, ethos, but in a kind of a, essential way, right? These people were solidly professionals of war under every point of view. The reason I think I want to stress always is that many people think that the Romans they sucked at cavalry fundamentally. This is, especially if you read Roman archaic history, the furthest from the truth that you can ever see. Leaving aside that even during, I don't know, the Second Punic War, you can easily see how tough and capable Roman cavalry and cavalry commanders were, and how fighting even against people that were renowned maybe for their cavalry as well. The Romans had a few cavalry also because Italy wasn't like the bad. Also, they didn't have many neighbors that made extensive use of cavalry. After all, like other peoples, but Italy had kind of good horses, but a few, and that explains in part also why there were less. But I mean, here it's not about a structural amount of cavalry. Here's a matter of the individual cavalryman, and here is still a warrior. So it's the full individualism that says screw discipline, screw civic sense, right? Here, these guys are the most aristocratic minded you can think, and they know to fight in every single damn way. And if you look at Roman history here, you see Roman cavalry has an astonishing power that even under Republican times remains this institution of the public horses, right, for the knights, the city that had that it is is against the logic of having land and having to serve in that equal proportion, right? It's a a relic of that massively aristocratic nature of Roman politics and military that dominated all this phase before, right? And the Romans always had a very soft spot for cavalry in an unbelievable way. But aside from that, this system couldn't hold, right? It's a system in crisis, right? We see that even from archaeology that there is a few wealth here, that it's difficult to control such a tiny amount of land where there are enemies swarming all around. And the patricians were so courageous in their sacral, religious, military, political prerogatives that they reinforced their economical control, right, from one side of the dominion of the scarce lands that had remained, but at the same time obliged them to survive, to also tighten as a consequence also the military participation to this. Right, if you really want to maintain everything in your hands, you have to accept that you have to keep a lot of people out of this, and this also creates internal political problems, because the Tarquinian Rome had been a completely different thing. Like, there were enormous trade circuits, other means of of getting wealth, etc. Now the thing was really dramatic, in spite of all. Right. Let's remember here that Rome was the single most important Latin city. Right. It was enormous. It was wealthy for the time standards. So it had a force, a big potential that eventually will be developed. But in these ways, such patrician attitude basically blocked it. Right. So the war against Veii in late 5th century BC and the character Furius Camillus here enter in the picture, in the legion, right, in some way or another. He was definitely one of the dominators, one of the rulers of Roman society of the time, right? And this, with him, really history starts taking an important turn in two ways. Like, from one side, the Roman army begins to receive a pay. Right? And this probably evolves in the situation described by the Servian Reform. That's why I was talking about the Servian Reform, because we think that happened fundamentally 1 century before. There was probably nothing like that, right? It was nothing in Roman society in that point. It could be nearly democratic, right? Here it begins once again, and we don't know how exactly. Like, history reports Furius Camillus and all his deeds, etc. But here we can imagine even part of the aristocracy, as we will see better later, that accepted in a way that the the military participation had to be extended. As we were saying before with Veii, there is a big problem of society you can't hold. Like if you want to make war now, you can't, that a war that lasts beyond the season, right? And for which peasants are taken, Roman peasants are taken away from the fields, and they have to, and they can't, they bring away their labor force, and they have to serve in the military, and they also lose money in general. I mean, they think about the equipment, the losses, the sheer, all the logistics here that is involved, right? The fact that Rome is able to seize Veii represents here a very important moment. It starts proving the Roman, starts boosting the Roman sense of superiority, right? That is starting to be something very different from a set of clans, right? It's evidently already through the Etruscan experience something more advanced, and this requires an equally advanced army, right? So pay at that point could happen only one way. That levels the situation. That is the second part of this turning point. It is the distribution of land and riches, right? Veii is, traditionally the first time soldiers were starting being called milites, because they had finally this wheat that was given to them as a pay for having, right? So here you realize already how Rome is first of all something very developed, can afford that, but only through this political change of extending the participation to the army to other groups, right? That is based probably on wealth, in fact, as the Servian Reform effectively wants to show. Now, if you go look at that video I made on the Servian Reform, you will also realize how, in spite of all, even if you don't have the actual proportions, you see that from a political point of view, as well from a military one, directly reflected. The noblemen, right, the patricians, have an enormous deal of importance still in this army, and cavalry has too, because the upper classes are to serve on horseback. That makes you understand how, and I stress in that video, from how much a brutal aristocratic military perspective that Rome was coming from, and how this process was probably very gradual, right? Now, when there is the Gallic invasion conventional in 390 BC, you know that the Romans were actually pretty, at that time the Gauls wouldn't from the Po Valley. Brennus was this major, prince that from well off from the Po Valley, wanted to, call to muster all these other allies and troops and whatever. It's a pretty large army, 20,000 say at the time, which is just more than a raid, right? But it was effectively aimed at targeting Etruria, right? The Romans were going fine, right? But they, in one secondary operation, they basically sided the Etruscan with the Etruscan cavalry against the Gauls. That's what triggered Brennus, and he decided to march on Rome, which he did without even losing time. I mean, devastating and pillaging the countryside, but going straight to Rome, like in a very orderly, disciplined fashion. And they did it, as we know, and this passed through the defeat prior to the occupation of Rome, the sack of Rome, say better, the defeat of the Allia River. Now, the defeat of the Allia River is very fascinating because it's usually regarded as, by me as well, the starting point in which we can date, essentially the theoretical beginning, even if we're not certain when this happened, of the effect of the manipular reform, right? Because the battles, if you study how the battle went, you realize that in there, the Romans were trying to cope with this linear formation that seemingly and possibly was already even at that time beginning to develop in multiple lines of battle, plus even a reserve that could be some proto-triarii at the time, that those were on the Roman right on the hill where the Gauls eventually, charged straight on them not to be surrounded. and making the rest collapse. So that the Romans would start thinking through this trauma and the idea of creating this layered formation to absorb, with a gradual fort, sending in reserves, conceptually. But that's well another point. The point though is that aside from the tactical changes, what the Camillian Reform was, in this regard, probably didn't have necessarily to do with the goals. And those hints at the Battle of Allia River probably talk about it, because they show not a single line, possibly, it's just an hypothesis, it's from the interpretation of Livy, right? If you read it. But already if something was, in fact, corresponding to different classes, because if you look at how the Roman, effectively, plebeian reform was, that's what it was, right? And we know there was a lot of back and forth names of the ranks changing, with the names, usually of weapons. The Greeks called their units with the names of their shields, usually. The Romans with the names of their weapons, so that's more interesting. So that there was a lot of back and forth in that 4th century eventually, but the trend was possibly already set by certain things that were happening before that. Probably from the siege of Veii, that campaign, and what that had meant for a city like Rome. So this is very fascinating, also because the tradition, the legion, whatever you want to call it, reports, as we were saying before, that Camillus, gave Rome the success, then he was essentially rejected, and then he came back and he manages to ransom the honor of Rome on the field. So however it's gone, the permanence of Camillus in later times, as witnessed by the Fasti, tells us that probably this is not just an invention, right? There was something in there, those political military changes that set Rome finally in this democratic base of recruitment, and that really eventually led to the legion as we know it. And this would prove that the Camillian army would be a formidable instrument, right? So, as we were saying before, the fact that this army was democratic doesn't mean at all that this had essentially a Reagan's hoplitism, as we think it, like it was citizens, like the vote in this close, thickly packed formation, just like Greek hoplites, a copy. How much people like to stress this, that armies copied things from others, right? If there is someone who integrated in a uniquely original system all what they could get from other peoples, was exactly wrong, right? And you can't do that if you are backwards than those people you're allegedly stealing something from, right? This is why this moment in Roman history is so crucial, because if you don't get properly through this, you can't understand a lot of things about what we see later, right? But the Romans were still half, essentially, warriors, and they would maintain that. We know it also from the same Battle of Allia. We know that their equipment, their fencing techniques were basically very, very similar to the ones of the Gauls, right? Big spears used individually, speaking, big swords, right? The Gallic swords of the Latin period of that point, between 450 to 250 BC, were pretty massive things that, that supports, from an archaeological point of view, what the Greek historians talk about that time. If you look at an Italic warrior of the same time, you look at the copies that they were wielding, those were freaking 70, 80 centimeters beasts. Like, you can't chop easily a person arm or leg with that. And it's typical of a true professional warrior, like just a warrior can be. Not like an amatorial militia of unprofessionals, right? If anything, the Camillian army is paid. So that is not an hoplitic model, if anything, by definition, right? These people are pretty, messed up from a psychological point of view. You wouldn't like to enter in a tribal mindset, right? But these people definitely know what it means to fight individually. That's something that the Romans will spend a terrific amount of resources to try to impart to extirpate, and the Roman legionnaire will remain deeply, like they were disciplined but still individualistic, even in the moments which they were trained to the highest, right, in republican imperial times. You see, these guys work fundamentally as monads, right? Even if they find information, it has nothing to do. These are not hoplites. They're completely different mindset. Completely different mindset. We'll have to make a massive video on this topic because it's one of the most fascinating ever. But even looking at their equipment, you can easily understand what these people were. Aside from this, what we see is amazing. Like you have first, so this is where the difference between patricians and plebeians begin, because guess what, now in the army there are people who are not patricians, right? And there is an enormous debate with the people. Is it a military name, is it just instead, is it detached from the political side, populus plebesque, all these problems like the patres conscripti, or patres or conscripti. I mean, we don't actually know. Patres means it's the fathers, naturally, and they were the ones originally, ideally, as senators founded by Romulus. So in this regard, also having been entrusted by the medium of the celestial authority, the military power, right, to rule over the society that they had found. This is the meaning of the legion. What were the conscripted then? Is it just like an accounting practices of saying, differentiating the families of the newer patricians that had been integrated later as conscripted? In fact, that's what it means from the patricians. What for? It was an honor to be a patrician. Once you were, would be called a conscriptus, like what the name of accountant would give you. Like, it's evidently not the case. Is populus the army? Well, possibly, we don't know, but the most likely interpretation is that the populus is actually something that is opposed to not just the patres, right? Because before we believed that the populus was everybody who participated to the army in this regard. Instead, it seems more likely that the populus and the patres were separated, as much as the populus and the rex, right? So there was a strong character in part of this sense of there was an actual people, all these middle classes that had grown during the Etruscan times in Rome, with all the craft activity, now we're suffering again, but they were, capable of fighting, right? There was a demographic strength in there, and they had to integrate them. So this is the big leap forward, right? So we have seen how the major changes, like what we call the Servian Reform, the Camillian Reform, actually happened much. I mean, with Camillian Reform, not really, but the Servian Reform much later, and much less clearly, and much less as actual reforms, as far as we can trace, at least historically, than they actually were. There were massive changes, but they happened gradually. It was a lot of evidently political negotiation. We're not really aware of actual open clashes, right? Which, especially in a case where the city is pressed from many sides, it's not really a good thing to do, even if it can happen, of course. But evidently Rome had the strengths now to commit all these people, also because part of these strengths were the same people that wanted to join in the army to extend their power, to extend their to get back what they had lost, from the moment of prosperity, and now, however, acquiring a higher status next to the aristocracy, which, if you think about it in those times perspective, is hallucinating, right? It's something that the aristocrats were like kind of bitterly, outraged by in some measure. But that's where, in fact, the people, the plebeians, acquire other, counter, as we will see, the intercession, also the sacrosanctitas, that were essentially a parallel to the sacral, prerogatives of the nobles, but still they were subordinated. As we were saying before, in Rome, the people never ruled. This is very important to stress. Like, it's never that was a revolution brought the people power, right? There were simply certain forms of autonomous organization that were built over time that were detached from the one of the patricians. And we will see now better how it happened. But it's obvious that this systems of land distributions is essentially triggered by the Camillian Reform, is what will bring Rome to the influence and power that it would have, right? Because they had now a larger army. In an army that is made not of citizens who were just sitting there, they not even touching a weapon, but people were mentally, in background, culturally speaking, part of already still a semi-tribal world, that therefore are channeled effectively towards something that they can do fairly well, that is war, right? And that's when also the curule magistrates and also the one provided with imperium. So now create at that point the patricians and the plebeians as we know it, right? The concept of imperium is previous to that, but it was, can imagine, a prerogative of the patricians. Now the plebeians, by participating to the army inherently, want to share the imperium. So this sacral military power conferred through some media such as the priests, but not only, but by the gods to the victorious, right? And it's obvious that if the people wins, if in a battle the army is strongly composed by these elements, the imperium is flowing in the veins of these people as well. Because this is what these people believe. Like the Romans believe now that they don't even have a properly, they still have a semi, not even polytheistic religion at this point. That they believe still in a semi, almost animistic picture. Here, also another thing I stress is how Rome eventually expanded. This makes you realize, you think that 1 century afterwards they were essentially defeating the Carthaginians in the Mediterranean. You realize how radically quick this whole Roman expansion was. I mean, from semi-barbarians to emperors of the Mediterranean in a few centuries. This is something that makes you understand all this massive pride and warlike essence of Rome stemmed from. Rome was solely based on the imperium concept, on the idea that Rome had the duty. This is what the Romans thought. And that most of barbarians thought, even though most never even achieved anything closer to this, that their destiny was to conquer the world. Well, the Romans knew this since the beginning. For the Romans, it was not a matter of if, but just of when. Right? The Romans, in this sense, were also very, they were determined, but they were blind to other things. They were very different from their Italic neighbors. Right? They didn't understand concept of humiliation. They realized that they had just to conquer, swallow all the other communities around, because that's what their fate was. Right? They truly believed that. There is no people after the Jews that conceived itself like so strongly and categorically and essentially as a chosen people like the Romans. No one. Having said this, I would like to stress also another aspect of this story, is that the thesis of the separation, the ethnical separation between the patricians and the plebeians, albeit fascinating, is wrong. Like as we were saying before, we don't have to think that the patricians were just the descendants of the Aryans, and the plebeians were just the conquered pre-Italic populations, right? Rome has one massive characteristic that, culturally speaking, maybe this remained. Like I'm personally sure, the more I study Roman history, the more I realize that the aristocratic Roman mentality was essentially of Indo-European background. Like the fact that if you conquer, you have the full right to do whatever you want, right? The Romans eventually developed a further greatness to this, that it was not to wipe out just, but sometimes also to incorporate, which was an enormous deal, and it's at the base of the whole imperial propagandistic idea of pacification, right? But if you look at archaic Rome, that was really the base of Roman greatness. It's the fact of being a cosmopolite city, a crossroad of so many influences coming from really many other places, right? So this great point of socio-cultural exchange since the origins, right? A melting pot of Mediterranean cultures, right? This is since the beginning, right? And this is the same nature of Rome. I mean, Rome is open. It's a city that is open to the river, to the valley, to the sea. It's unavoidably so, right? And placed also in the center of the Mediterranean and so on. And this is the frame that, in my opinion, we must give to how this passage effectively happened, right? Now we have to pass on how Roman tradition saw this, like historically speaking. So are we saying before for truly no real consensus, the formation of the patricians and the plebeians, that we can stress as, okay, this is it, right? If we look at tradition from Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Plutarch, right, we see this fiction, that is the distinction of the two orders, the two ordines, since the beginning, right? The patricians would derive from the patres, the fathers, the senators appointed by Romulus himself, while the plebs would have instead been constituted by the popular mass. Now, the repartition of the Roman citizens would therefore, on a aristocratic base, right? So that the patricians were the members of this familiar groups, clans, that is the gentes, descending from the pater, from the father, right? The strong male line of the Indo-European tradition of the warrior, of the chieftain, right? That detained in a certain sense, either by delegation in general, either by the god or the king of the imperium, really sharing, participating to it, because he was a warrior by definition. And this is what effectively would have formed the, let's say, the Romulan Senate, right, if there was ever such a thing, which probably there was. I mean, meaning that there were councils, since every society was here having similar institutions in a way or another. The problem, though, is that this pattern gets complicated by the arrival of the so-called patres conscripti that we were saying before, that entered fully in the senatorial assembly, right? That in this sense has been interpreted as maybe the minores gentes, that is the lesser families of the patriciate, of the patricians, that the tradition put usually at around the time of Tarquinius Priscus, or the first consuls, right? So this naturally can be interpreted as what we're saying right now, that is, that there was a continuous integration of further noble groups that were not necessarily dominators, but that were still entering, however, in a system that was open, right? Now we don't understand here what the conscriptus actually means, right? If they were lesser for real, or if they were the patres themselves were conscripti, like an assembly, because that's what the idea is that there is an inscribement, like of a closed group, also an exclusivistic group, typical of the aristocracy. We don't know. And by now, I think you have realized that trying to reconstruct this archaic society presents so many difficulties, right? First of all, the ancient historians looked chiefly at a political military history here to tell, that is probably not wrong in many ways, but it doesn't tell us so much about society and economics, for example. Both because the literary sources are later, right? It came centuries later, or possibly because they were, misinterpreted. Because we have to realize that objectively, I don't know, in the 1st century BC, and if you take Cicero or Livius, they surely knew much more about that past than we do. We know even through the sources, because they're mentioning things that they knew were there at the time that we, however, were not aware of, because we don't have the evidence of. So they knew there was a shared memory, but this whole thing had risen so fast. Rome had expanded so fast. So you can imagine all the various, how these memories had got blended, right? This is interesting because Rome actually had a early stage of development in the sense that, I don't know, but if you see that, for example, literacy was quite widespread at one point, but the point is that the idea of the construction of a collective memory was a Roman collective memory was a big deal, especially when still the city wasn't a monad, like with a defined institute. Rome evolved over time, transformed over time. So all those changes influenced the reading of the past, assuming they also knew so much, because mostly they didn't. The same Roman archaic religion by the 1st century BC had been substantially forgotten. The Romans replayed their rites, but it's not that they actually knew the original meaning anymore. Think about that, right? So the uncertainty of the data provided by the tradition have been interpreted in different ways. For example, concerning the existence of true cults, right? Of, for example, the various patrician gentes. That's a big deal, because it means that these lineages, possibly so, even I don't want to say totemic necessarily, but that they had and also probably their original heterogeneity reinforced in their elitism, their individual characters, right? The gentes really had different backgrounds and mindsets, as we have seen, right? These were normally warlike deities, while the plebeians had others on their own. This is very interesting. Like the rise of the plebs is associated to even a sort of paralleling of the patrician institutions. For example, the patricians were the plebeians were represented religiously by the temple of Ceres, Liberus, and the Libera on the Aventine. Now, the Aventine is interesting because the Aventine wasn't inside Rome at the time. So, this is a way with, that there is the Aventinian secession of the plebeians that disagree with the patricians, and they abandon Rome, they settle on the Aventine, and where they want to build this counter capital, essentially, so that to stress that they had a power on their own, and also not to be subjected actually to the sacred law of Rome that existed within the sacred boundaries of Rome, right? Including their political councils, which otherwise they could have been, accused of conspiring against the gods, and read the patricians in that regard. But even in this, so Ceres is naturally, the deity of fertility of the land. Is this, Liberus and Libera are this bit, lower, kind of popular-like characterized individuals that are like to drink and to have sex. There is this broader anthropological interpretation that the popular classes are, that they are kind of backed by the most needy, of this. The deity of wheat and of wine, of sex, this more vulgar character, ideally, and also pertaining to this more female side of the story that in the history of religion is the idea that the pantheons of all the Europeans basically were founded in this regard traditionally by the fact that the Indo-Europeans brought male warlike deities, and the pre-existing populations had the female fertility and agricultural deities, and that eventually they were blended in. And this is a true thing, actually. If you look at these various pantheons, especially in the Hellenic, but it's pretty clear, right? There were lots of associations. You do realize that blending. So this stereotype and the cliche that, as we have seen, has probably been stilized. Who knows? Maybe the same Romans is that, I mean, yeah, the patricians were more like the Indo-European military rulers, and the people, the subjected agriculturalists, peasants that were not, didn't have the privilege of bearing arms. Right? This is the general prejudice, but it's very loose. And as we were saying before, in actual history, we don't think that a Roman society was actually born like that. Yet we don't have to exclude the fact that, of course, who bore arms believed in Rome to be divinely elected. So it doesn't matter where you came from. The problem is that, if you were inferior, you were inferior because the gods had wanted you so. Right? So that's also why the Camillian Reform is such a huge deal, because now the people take the arms as well. That's a massive deal. They were, as we'll see now, the people... once again, we're reading all of this through the lenses of the 1st century BC, where the people had struggled. Think about all the Gracchi and the assassinations, all these, tensions that had occurred in much more recent times. We don't know what it was like at the beginning. It's quite likely that this people were framed all in the patrician clientele. So it was not such a classist separation after all, right? But not even later was actually in this way proper. But it's surely more accentuated, and that's where Roman historiography, in a certain sense, reinvented or re-stilized or reinterpreted or whatever history through that pattern. And it's possible, and it still tells us that for them, even having this different deities was a big deal, because at the time people believed in the gods in that way, that there was really an identitary matter in the process. Like, let's not think that polytheism was simply choosing whichever god you liked, because you could definitely do it, but there was still a sort of nature that was perceived as an identity associated to a particular divinity that you were tied to. So these social differences surely belonged, they were paralleled by these religious systems as well. So that a patrician would have had contempt, generally speaking, in the origin towards this, agricultural deities. Because what does a patrician do? Plow the land? Hell no. He goes slaughtering his enemies and seizing his booty and women. That's it, right? So it's a wholly different mindset, which probably existed at the beginning, but after centuries now of sedentarization of the italics, it's quite not really the case. But with the reference to the organization of the army, also in here there's been the other cliche that the patricians are seen as the knights, as the horsemen, right? And while the plebeians as the infantry, right? So the popular infantry. Is it possible also in here that the thing was much more shaded, right? There were very powerful plebeians as well, as far as we know. Like, think about all the... during Etruscan times, this is the important thing, is that it brought in artisans, technicians, merchants, right? So these all they were professionals in many ways. So they had their own dignity, they had their own lifestyle. They were intelligent, resourceful, ingenious people. So the plebeians had a dignity that we can't see reading a class this way. Those were like the poor workers. Like, there were people like that, but there were many plebeians that were at the head of them and that didn't give a damn in the first place, like it would happen later. Again, Rome has always been an oligarchy, even with the patricians shared power with the plebeians. Always. The plebeians had their own oligarchs. But it's possible, definitely, that we know that the Romans never had, for example, an army composed solely by cavalrymen, just the celeres of Romulus, maybe, the original horsemen of the of Romulus' retinue bodyguard, but that was really a legendary time. Maybe it has some truth. In fact, it has, in my opinion, quite solidly. But at this time, the Roman army was solidly the majority of infantry, like actually most of European armies were, right? Only when you get to the steppes, you see nomadic peoples. All these peoples everywhere in Europe were chiefly infantrymen, right? This doesn't mean that there wasn't an elite of cavalrymen, and definitely among these elites were the richest, hence the patricians in general, right? But it's not a fixed category. I mean, a rigid category, excuse me. The same goes for the economical point of view. The idea of the plebs, as we've seen, as the urban artisan class devoted to the mercantile activities, and the patricians as the class of landowners that had their slaves, that that worked the land and had livestock and so on, right? This also signifies something, because agriculture here, like, you can have slaves, and they definitely had them, but still, that's partly agricultural. That's partly being involved in selling your agricultural products, your livestock products. So it's obvious that patricians and plebeians were living in symbiosis in many ways. But it's obvious that who held the land in a pre-industrial society is effectively the guy that rules. That's why all the deal of giving land to the people as well, so that they could serve in the army, they could be wealthy enough to fight in the Camillian Reform. Then, so it's obvious that this most banal explanation of the poor plebeians and the rich patricians has been discussed, and there were, among the plebeians, there were definitely certain economical instances, right? But they're expressed by the sources with those ways that we've perfectly recognized, that are dated to the political and social struggles of the time of the Gracchi. So in a time that was far past behind all of whatever this thing had been about, because the army of citizens had already been created and had gone in crisis after the Punic Wars. Now the Gracchi were actually oligarchs on their own. They just wanted to... Their reforms were not even so revolutionary as they're sometimes credited. Now, I mean, our historiography knows that now, but... So we can recognize that this has been invented centuries later as an interpretation. While in the archaic times, the ruling class of Rome was not that different economically from the effectively subordinated classes, right? As we were saying before, the Italics were not so deeply stratified, right? The Romans were more than the others, but there's still not a categorical difference. Nothing to do absolutely by any standard with the Etruscans, for example, or the Umbrians we were dealing before. So the split between patricians and plebeians coexists with this other repartition of Roman society between the adsidui, that is to say the owners of lands, basically, and that according to the Servian Reform served in the centuriate army, like with all the centuriae that at that point were not just a military but in fact a political unit, and then separated from the adsidui, the capite censi, or infraclassem, that were excluded from the military levy. So other pattern, dichotomic pattern. So the sensual organization of the Roman reforms, that we call it like the Servian one, the Camillian ones, definitely allowed a social mobility, because being based on a democratic principle, who had enough money could enter in the top, right? And this is, we have seen it many times. This was the same, that other video we made on communal Italy. The medieval communal armies there were essentially working the same way, that the knights included a lot of people coming from the lower strata, as long as they were strong, right? The problem is what there is the crisis that cannot include everybody, hence the transformation. that takes over, that in the Middle Ages didn't, but in Roman times did, because these guys were pushing hard from demographic and economical point of view. They had the upper hand over cavalry. Do not underestimate here even the tactical problem. Cavalry and infantry need each other on the field, and italic warfare is pretty damn intense, right? So the dichotomy between patricians and plebeians therefore cannot be seen as a merely social difference, right? It's more probably close to familial difference, a horizontal and not vertical division, right? It's a sort of counterposition between an aristocracy by birth and of a generic popular multitude. Now, according to the tradition, the plebs was rising because vexed by the slavery for debts, the so-called nexum, right? And that means that who was poorer and was obliged to contract debts that often, since they couldn't be paid, brought to the nexum. In fact, that is to the loss of personal freedom, of who had to repay the creditor through his own work. So this you understand also how the system through which the clienteles had formed. So the plebeian movements broke up in this open revolt, let's say in 494 traditionally. As we've seen, we don't realize this happened much later in some way, if it happened at all, as a single event, with the secession of the Aventine, or over the Mons Sacrum, that is another hill. This was outside of Rome. This is very important. Rome had a pomerium, as you know. That was what Romulus had traced, and all the the political social contract stemmed from that idea that also there was a sacred soil, that Rome was an actual entity, was an actual spirit, right, on a sacred land. So going outside of it, this meant the plebeians refused to participate to the Roman civic life and to the consequent military duties. That was a big deal, because naturally in a moment of military emergency, if the people says, we don't want to fight and you have to negotiate with us if you want us to come to war, otherwise we all lose, well, that's a big deal, right? It's this, even the veto right that, as we'll see now, was developed, that if you think about it, in a parliamentary democracy today, what would be that there could be a tribune that everything that happens can raise the veto and say, okay, no, here the whole session jumps, you can't do anything because we vetoed it, right? It's obvious that these provisions came from the so-called metus hostilis, to the idea that the city was tremendously pressured by the external enemies. The metus hostilis is much older in Rome than to the time of Hannibal at the gates, right? Think about the Gauls that sacked the city, for example. So if you are not politically cohesive, you go nowhere in a military expedition. So this naturally is always an historiographical construction, come later, but that still shows the importance in the Roman institutions of the people as such. So the apology of the authoritative plebeian Menenius Agrippa through the colorful pictures of the indispensable concord among all the parts of the human body convinced those who were revolted to treat, but probably was the other way around. Here it's Rome that wins, right? The idea that there is that real concord, but we have to think they struggle to have been harsher in terms of what the hell do we do now? And this corporatist political theory, the idea we all have to act as one, right? That will return so much in later medieval, modern political theory. And so compared to the proto-republican period, the Etruscan monarchy, for the inferior classes had been characterized by a major possibility of social improvement, right? As we have seen, Etruscan Rome was florid, was open to so many traffics. When the Etruscan influence crumbles, right, and this whole system breaks down, even all these masses of the people now were upset by, but they had gained their own power, had risen in the meanwhile. So that's where the problem what we addressed before about the aristocracy was trying still to keep control of all of this now without the backing of the Etruscan king. In the beginning of the republics, therefore represent a sort of enclosing and growing war commitment against the bordering peoples, as we've seen. So that's when, as we've seen, the need of the plebeians to break free from this situation. A society in crisis that cannot keep working like that. Hence, this political conquest that is traditionally dated to 493 BC of the plebeian secession, and the creation as a consequence of these two special magistrates that in a few years would have become traditionally 10, that is the tribunes of the plebs, the famous tribunes of the plebs that were entrusted with the duty to defend the plebeians by every kind of decision, the so-called jus auxilii, right? This was a big deal of the time because the tribune could prevent every act of the patrician magistrate that could harm the plebs or a single plebeian. Right? It was exercised either by free initiative of the tribune or following an appeal of the plebs that naturally also increased over time in this perspective. And this was the foundation of the veto right, the intercessio, right? So, which in Roman public law, as you know, is this veto power with the exercise of which allowed to prevent the fulfillment of constitutionally relevant acts, right? And it in particular, it was a prerogative of the tribune of the plebs towards every state organism, in origin especially of the patrician magistrates, but also the same colleagues, right? This is very, very important. And so this was on what concept was this really based, right? The fundamental concept behind this is the sacro sanctitas. That is to say that the sacralization of the same tribune, right? Everybody would have offended the tribune in a way or another, would have become sacred, that is, voted to the infernal gods, and therefore he could be killed by anyone. Think at how powerful this plebeian prerogative actually was, right? You couldn't touch a tribune. You couldn't, that was untouchable. It was the true sacral equivalence of the sacral prerogatives of the patricians that, patrician class that was also the sacerdotal one. This is a big deal. The so-called sacred laws were granted by this solemn oath that committed he who was called to make them respected. So the tribunes were elected by the assemblies of the plebs, the so-called concilia plebis, right, that conquered the electoral and deliberative capacities. And there were the plebisciti, that were decisions taken by such assemblies that from 471 BC were allegedly were called concilia plebis tributi. In fact, the Roman territory was effectively divided in 4 urban tribes and 7 rustic tribes, right, in which the citizens were framed on the base of their residence and voted within their own tribe. So they basically instituted with the concilia plebis a parallel system to the comitia centuriati from Servian Reform, in which the centuries of the first classes had the preeminence, right? And these assemblies resulted of the plebs. Resulted more democratic because every tribe had basically the same decisional power. In the official political and military system, of course, the aristocracy retained the greatest power, and it would remain like that if you look at it from a perspective of social segmentation. It would evolve towards the clear. The lower classes never made it, but still they had this parallel form of political organization that we also don't know basically not much about. We don't know what the Concilia Plebis actually did. They organized their own stuff, but so it was a recognition that they had a sacred oath. They had a society that also had its own tutelar gods and so on, but it was still in parallel to the system, was more in force from a political and military point of view, the one that the army was in charge with. So this is very interesting because it shows you that the plebeians, after all, never quite created a parallel military body. They remained always framed into the Roman army as such, which is different what happened historically in other contexts, right? Not of the Romans, but in other societies that evolved in a different way. So this naturally could be interpreted, I don't know, through the fact that objectively Rome did need that unity, through the fact that, in the moment of difficulty, or through the fact that these societies were much more lapped and intertwined than we think that the late Republican Romans thought they were, right? Because objectively, in late Republican times, it was a much more evident social struggle in the sense that poorer classes never had a chance. The overwhelming majority of Roman citizens were reduced to the 2nd century BC to a state of semi-serfdom in some cases, that there wasn't much to do there. The Gracchi, the assassination, that's where Republic begins to end, because that system that had allowed the traditional, citizen soldier system to work was effectively jumped. Now it didn't exist anymore, and Rome kept on through further oligarchization and eventually the monarchy of the empire, right? So, but it was much more evident in terms of social inequality at the time that there was a difference between the highest, the most powerful side of the population and the lowest. Well, in the 5th century, in the 4th century, this was even not so evident. Or at least it was much less pronounced, for sure. So, the recognitions obtained by the plebs were essentially of political character, because the economical problems such as the indebtedness or the famines that actually happened, seemingly, during the 5th century, with a certain frequency, didn't, bring to a major reforms of other kind. The Roman state decided in practice just to acquire wheat outside of its territory as a consequence, and that's really not the picture of a freely democratic society for sure, right? So, as we were saying before, Rome is always an oligarchy, by far. And the proposals of the distributions of land attributed traditionally to Spurius Cassius in 486 BC, what do they remind you? But of course, the conditions of the ager publicus on the agrarian laws of the Gracchi in the last centuries of the Republic, right? That's the copy of it. That's what that history came from, right? This, however, doesn't mean that the general conditions of inferiority of the plebs had provoked disorders and social contrasts, right? In Rome, the people was always a big deal, right? Even in Augustan times, there were all the various collegia, right, that were effectively corporations / mobs that, controlled the city, the economical travel, the logistical system and the government had to be quite careful of controlling it. It wasn't easy at all to keep the Roman mob happy, right? So that's how basically the late Republican Romans were thinking at their past, basically collecting the various traditions and clothing them with legendary characters, right? With all these dots, these events, these characters, etc. And therefore, for example, the fierce aristocrat Coriolanus would have led the Volsci against Rome in order to vindicate himself of the exile that was actually inflicted to him on instance of the plebs, that was unhappy of the arrogant attitude of the patrician that, according to the requests, in front of the requests of the hungry plebeians, proposed instead the abolition of the tribunate of the plebs. That's another story, right? Coriolanus eventually was defeated here, but the idea that there was this given moral due in the political history of Rome, and this idea that there had been effectively a clash between the patricians and the plebeians on that ground. Right? So we'll have to talk about these things in greater detail and also in expanding it on another occasion, but for today I think we can stop here. And you realize how fascinating this period is, because it's like reading a story written much later, with all a particular bias, but at the same time observing a reality that Rome was at the time. And we can't know well, but that all these bodies of semi-legendary, corpus of semi-legendary history can make see in a little part, right? And we're lucky enough, in fact, to know about more the political and military affairs, because that helps to explain also what Rome began to do. Because, as von Clausewitz teaches us, through the military, through war, we can understand a freaking enormous deal about politics and society, right? And that's why studying Roman reforms is so important, not to play toy soldier to say, which kind of weapon did this legionary have? We are like 55 million videos about this on YouTube, but actually understanding that those armies were the reflection of political and social system. That is an enormous deal, because if you don't understand that, you can't understand anything about war. I mean, the actual, even strategical culture that people in their achievements, and why Rome became the one that was, right? This is not a video game. This was a serious thing, and a very complicated one. And historically speaking, it's challenging to express judgments in this regard. Yet, I think we are. These are topics that, albeit debated, at least they are fairly easy accessible. Right, the idea is that, the sources are those ones. Like, you should know, of course, a lot of the whole ancient world sources in order to understand a lot of things here. But, it gets down to things you can track fairly easily without so much difficulty after all. But anyhow, let's stop it here. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.